As I said, tonight is called The Crisis of Zionism at the UN. And I begin by making the following observation, that wars are funny things with unexpected beneficiaries. That's like a rule of history. And by that I mean third-party beneficiaries. Take, for example, you see on the screen here, the First World War. It was a war between Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas. What happened at the end? Wilhelm got kicked off, Nicholas got wiped out, and Lenin took over. Thus, he's the beneficiary. Who's Lenin? He didn't even exist in the war. See what happens? Is Reuben fights Shimon, and Levi picks up the pieces. It's a rule of history. It's funny. You know, it's the unexpected consequences. You think it's between this one, and somebody totally unexpected turns out to be the real beneficiary. And what's important, though, for that to happen is to have an organization in place prior to the war, so that the organization may maneuver to take advantage of events to advance its own interests. So a classic case is Zionism. Because Herzl set up an organization, imperfect as it was, there was an actual organization, a group, organized group, ready in 1914. You know, and I know, they didn't fight the First World War to make the Balfour Declaration and give Palestine to the Jews, but this what happened. So besides Lenin, another person or group that was a beneficiary of the First World War in a completely unexpected fashion was the Jews. You see? So, and Lenin, by the way, also had an organization. That's what Leninism is all about. He created a very tight, top-down organization, so they were in place when the First World War happened and the Tsar was going down. He and his guys were super organized for their one goal of taking power, and that's what they did. The Zionist movement, which was a recognized political organization, actually gained not only from the First World War, but from the Second World War. Even though Zionism was obviously the farthest thing from the minds of the big three when they went to war against Hitler. I mean, England did not go to war against Germany in 1939 because of the Jews. Stalin sure as heck didn't go to war against Hitler. He was attacked by Hitler for the Jews. Roosevelt didn't declare war after Pearl Harbor because of the Jews, right? And the Jews are also great sufferers, obviously, from World War II. But they also benefit. You would not get the state of Israel without the Second World War. So the big three, as you see over here in Yalta, had all kind of things to talk about. No, they also brought up Zionism. Isn't that interesting? Among the many things they talked about. The German front, the Japanese front, the post-war world, all this kind of stuff. And they also schmoozed on Zionism. Look at this. This is from the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Organization, right after. Look what it says. Jewish problems were discussed. This is written in March of 45. Were discussed among Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin during the historic Yalta Conference, which took place in February. It was learned here following publication last night of records of the conference, meaning obviously some records. They didn't release all the records. But this is 1 month, Roosevelt's still in office. This is 1 month after Yalta. President Roosevelt told Stalin he's a Zionist. And he asked Stalin, this is almost surreal, and he asked Stalin, are you a Zionist? Stalin replied, he was one in principle, but he recognized the difficulty. Now, I understand he's a liar, but it's interesting. Well, it's an interesting conversation. He recognized the difficulty. The exchange of these remarks was preceded by a statement by Roosevelt telling Stalin he had 3 kings waiting for him in the Near East, including King Ibn Saud, who he would famously meet with on the way back from the Yalta Conference. Stalin said that the Jewish problem was a difficult one, that they had tried to establish a national home in Birobidzhan, but that they only stayed there 2 or 3 years and then scattered to the city. Jews were natural traders, said Stalin, but much had been accomplished by putting small groups in some agricultural areas. They call that the gulag, you know. The New York Times said it's not clearly from the text as released why Stalin began talking about the Jewish problem. A lot of asterisks preceded his statement, seemed to raise the possibility that one of the colleagues initiated discussion of Jews with statements censored from the public text. There is really such a thing now, and Stalin said the Jews are all phony and bad and this, and that, and the other, and Roosevelt said, yeah, I agree with you. But, you know, they were shooting the bull all over the place. Look at this. This is unbelievable. During the same state dinner meeting, which took place in February 10th, this at Yalta, the big three, President Roosevelt said he recalled that there had been an organization in the U.S. called the Ku Klux Klan that hated the Catholics and the Jews. And that once, when Roosevelt was on a visit in a small town in the South, he was a guest at a local chamber of commerce. He sat next, this is a small town in the South. Where's Rabbi Hubris? Here you go. So he says, he sat next to an Italian on one side and a Jew on the other side. and he asked the president of the Chamber of Congress, what about the KKK? And the guy says, I'm in the KKK. There are people in KKK, but it's all right since everybody in the community knew him. In other words, it's the local Jewish grocery store. It's the local Italian, tailor or something like that. It's the local Jew. That's a different story. You get it? That's a different story. Roosevelt remarked that it was a good illustration of how difficult it was to have prejudice, racial, religious, or otherwise, if you really knew people. And Stalin said, this is very true. Right. And I'm sure, meanwhile, you're thinking, what a nut. But by the way, that's a very true story. It reminded me of a famous story I read many years ago about Rabbi Geffen from Atlanta. Some people may remember their name. You know him because of the Coca-Cola. But 100 years ago, literally 100 years ago, he was the big Rav in the South, in the Atlanta of yesteryear. And somebody wrote an article about him. And I remember it was like 1920, 1930, something like that, that he got a phone call from the state penitentiary in Atlanta. And they said, there's a guy here who says he's Jewish, he's talking funny language, and he wants to see a rabbi. And you're the Orthodox rabbi. See, he went there with his son, who was a lawyer or a law school student, and this is the Atlanta of old. And it turned out, I'm telling you what I read. It turned out the guy had been a Jewish peddler, as he used to have in the South. He was peddling from town to town, walking, and he hitched a ride. And it turned out he hitched the ride with the wrong car. It was some kind of a Bonnie and Clyde type operation. You understand? So a few miles later, it was a shootout with the state police. And this guy figured, like, what's going on? And he got arrested, and he couldn't talk English. And so naturally, the judge threw the book at him, And so now he's at hard labor in the South in 1930, whatever, for part of Bonnie and Clyde. And hard labor in the South was hard labor in the South. I remember I was a prisoner of the chain gang. Remember that? So, and now it's Passover. He was asking for a rabbi. And so he went there, he talked, and the guy explained to him in Yiddish what's going on. And Rabbi Geffen then went straight from the penitentiary to the State House in Atlanta. And the governor at that time was Eugene Talmadge, who was actually the president of the KKK. That's the Talmadge. He's one of the famous Georgia politicians of yesteryear, who, honestly speaking, was one of the big racists. I mean, that's who these guys were. We're not talking today, we're talking long ago. And his secretary didn't want to let him in, but Rabbi Geffen and his son, because he couldn't talk English so well, they kind of forced their way in the governor's office, and the guy was in his suspenders, all the rest of it, and he told his son, tell the governor they got the wrong guy. It was a mix-up. And the governor said like this, well, he heard it out, he said, I guess that makes sense to me, I'll sign the pardon here and now. And the secretary said, you're going to listen to this guy? He said, if the rabbi said it, it's good enough for me. You understand? And the guy, instead of, in other words, let's put it this way, it's like Erev Pesach. The end of the story is that night, the guy was at the Seder in the home of Rabbi Geffen. It's just a nice story. So I'm simply telling you that FDR was not exactly wrong when he said, if you know people on a personal basis, or local, it's a different story. I've told you 100 times that you can't go, even though history books are written that way, in a kind of a black and white perspective, because somebody said something once against Jews, that means they're anti-Semite, or because somebody said something nice about Jews, that they were pro-Semite. And same thing for blacks, pro and con, and for Spanish, and any cause you want. People are more complex than that. At least that's my argument. Now let's move on.
Even Hitler was trying to
Okay.
his mother's decision. He was Jewish.
Okay. Now, Zionism did benefit, in a sense, unexpected, but benefit from the Holocaust, simply because the DP camps, look what happened when Eisenhower. This was, you know this.
At this concentration camp in the Goda area, the Germans starved, mugged, and burned to death more than 4,000 political prisoners over a period of 8 months.
This was seen in movie houses everywhere.
By hiding in the woods. The camp was chosen for a high command inspection led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Also present are Generals Omar M. Bradley and George S. Patton. The 4th Armored Division of General Patton's 3rd Army liberated this camp early in April. The general's view.
I don't want to show you the bad stuff, Eisenhower. Bradley.
They see the woodshed where lime-covered bodies are stacked in layers and the stench is overpowering.
All right, so those world leaders were there, and obviously that profoundly affected the politics of 1947-48 when the United States came and backed Israel and recognized Israel, all the rest of it, in spite of the opposition, the totally understandable opposition of the State Department. Right? Even Truman said, I couldn't find it again, I had it years ago. There's a statement from Truman, he says, I saw the movies and ever since then till this day I have nightmares. Okay? So this is what's moving them, among other things, but it's moving them into decisions to back Zionism, even though they were not pro-Zionist. But at that particular time, right after the war, so what are you going to do? There's almost a straight line, if you wish, between the horrible pictures I just showed you and Weissman at the White House. And Truman's famous statement, I always wanted one of these. What are you supposed to do? Okay?
Kosher?
Huh?
Was it a kosher one?
Only a Yankee would ask a question like that. He says, right?
Didn't answer it.
Yeah, right. It's in the Truman Museum, so we could examine it. It is on display, all joking aside. Anyway, you get the idea. Why did one lead to the other? That wasn't part of the plan when America went to war after Pearl Harbor, but that's what happens, that they're unintended beneficiaries of great processes. Okay, now I'm going to get to the depressing stuff. The Israel-Palestinian question of who benefits from what. From 1948 to 1964, I would remind you, Palestinians were not an organized national group. That's very important. For the first 16 years of Israel, Palestinians, as we call them today, were not an organized national group. There were attempts by the Grand Mufti, who was the leader of the Palestinian nationalists, but he bet on the wrong horse. He bet on Hitler. And he thought, because the Arabs still to this day can't get it, that if he backs the wrong guy, he'll switch again. He didn't realize that the world at that time, simply to say this leader had been friends with Hitler, made you puzzle, made you trafe. You understand? There was such a feeling once upon a time. Anybody's literally connected with the Third Reich. So up there was a government he tried to form in Gaza during the middle of 1948 with a cabinet and all the rest of it. But of course, Israel's victories and the fact that, let me put it this way, from the strictly narrow, cynical Israeli point of view, from Ben Gurion's point of view, you couldn't get a better leader of the Palestinians than the Mufti. Because that guy really has zero legitimacy, if you get it. All he has to say is, he's a friend with Hitler, which he was. I mean, let's get this straight. The Grand Mufti recruited Muslims in the Balkans to form brigades and divisions for the Nazi army in Bosnia and places like that, in Albania. I mean, he was really an active guy. So you got the wrong guy, as your leader. And during these 16 years, so Israel had like a breathing space, you might say, for 16 years. The chief opponent of the Palestinians as a people was Jordan, okay? I mean, here's King Abdullah meeting with the British, and then what you see over here, I don't have my pointer, at the bottom is what they call the Jericho Conference. It's cold in October, November of 48, when the Palestinians, those the people who live on the West Bank, were so scared that the Tzahal was about to take them over, which is true, that, thank you. He said, thank you. So he says, they were so afraid of the Israeli army that they were willing to appeal to King Abdullah of Jordan, you be our leader and have the Jordanian Arab Legion occupy here, so at least we'll be under Arabs. So they were officially accepting King Abdullah as the king, and therefore the ruler of the West Bank, as we call it, in order because they were afraid of Israel. So again, that was good for Israel in the sense that there's no opposing Palestinian nationalism. So if you're Ben Gurion around 1950, there's no move anywhere for the Palestinians to have a state of their own. There are issues between two different states. One is called Israel, one's called Jordan. That's of a different character. You understand? Between states, you can have negotiations, hot periods, cold periods, this and that and the other, but it's somebody to talk to. But you don't have what I'm referring to. And so After Abdullah was killed in 1951 by a Palestinian who resented exactly what I just told you, within a short while he was replaced by his grandson, King Hussein, who was there for 50 years. So King Hussein was the same thing. As long as he was able to, he was ruling the West Bank, and he was an opponent of Palestinian nationalism because against his interest. You don't have a separate state, you're just a chalik of my state. Jordan is a big, big enough for everybody. Jordan gave all the Palestinians on the West Bank Jordanian citizenship. They really did. And they gave them full, Jordanian rights, which they really did. And they could vote for delegates and representatives in the Jordanian parliament in Amman, which they really did. And so what's your problem? You're part of an Arab country, which I'll say again, from the Ben-Gurion point of view, is a good thing. Do you follow what I'm saying? From the narrow, Ben-Gurionist perspective, people didn't realize that was a lucky business because then it's not a Palestinian versus Jewish nationalist interest, it's an Israel versus Jordan kind of thing. Okay, but we've also seen, most of you, that by the early 1960s, under the patronage of Nasser of Egypt, who hates King Hussein, the Palestinians finally formed a PLO. So they were 67 years after the Zionists. If you're an Arab, you kick yourself today. Why did we take so long? The Jews were smart enough to put together an organization way back in 1897. And the Palestinians did not get around to doing that till much, much later. So Israel, the Zionists, from the Arab perspective, have a 65-year or so head start over us. That's the cause of all the trouble. Now, once they formed a Palestinian Liberation Organization, whatever you want to call it, once they have an organized form, this is a great leap forward for the Palestinians. Until then, they didn't exist in the minds of nations outside the Arab world. I don't know if you're old enough to remember that, the memory is so funny. I can't remember some of my children's birthdays, but I can remember, nor can you. He said, but I can remember certain things from my youth, and I remember the 64 in Queens, the World Fair. Everybody remember that? No, but I'm talking about something specific. And I remember the Jordan embassy had a whole thing about the refugees. Does anybody recall that? And nobody knew what they were talking about. I mean, unless you were really a follower. I read in the Jewish Times when I was a kid, years ago, because Jewish publications followed that sort of thing. I'm sure in the minds of the people, that's a nice picture of a poor child. It didn't connect as a Palestinian-Israeli issue. Those words weren't used at that time. You understand? So they were feeling bad for the Arabs who were kicked out of Israel in the 48 war, who were now in refugee camps inside the West Bank. I'll say it again. It was under Jordan, but the Jordanians did not undertake, and the people did not ask, to be moved out of refugee camps within the West Bank. Okay, is that clear? Because they're from Jaffa, for example, or they're from Tzfat or whatever. So that was the situation at that time. It didn't register in the world opinion. Like I said, the only ones, listen, I was a young kid. I didn't read all the papers. But I don't recall, the best I can, that this made a big splash anywhere. So this is very important what I'm talking about, how you fare in the world opinion. However, within 3 years, the PLO was strong enough to trigger the Six-Day War, from which they benefited immensely. Okay? Because all of a sudden, this is the result of the Six-Day War. Nobody ever heard of this guy. And all of a sudden, if you're in front page of Time magazine, in our culture, that means you, so to speak, made it in terms of consciousness within the West. The PLO, or specifically Al-Fatah, started raids into Israel in '65. This, Israel, wisely or unwisely, started hitting back into Syria, and the raids and the raids on Syria and back and forth led to the Six-Day War. Okay, and who benefited from that? So you can say, well, Israel benefited. They took over the Golan Heights, and the other territories. All right, agreed. Who else benefited from it? You understand? And the answer is the Palestinians. King Hussein did not benefit from the opposite. Egypt did not benefit from the opposite. So Utaka benefited from the Six-Day War. Israel in a certain sense, and the Palestinians in the other sense. By their policy of continuous armed struggle against the Israelis. They're the ones, they said, we're never stopping. If you kill us today, we'll send another one tomorrow. If you kill that tomorrow, we'll send another one the next day. Doing this at a time, particularly after the Six-Day War, when the Arab states have been badly defeated and are condemned to be passive by the military situation, the PLO, and especially Arafat's group, Al-Fatah, gains giant traction in 4 important zones in the world. first of all, in the Arab world, the Arab street as they call it. So even they hate each other, but King Hussein has to smile. And all across the Arab world, obviously, the PLO, the Fatah are the heroes, because they're the only ones going against Israel and doing something, killing Jews, which was true. So all of a sudden, in a place like Morocco, Arafat's a hero, and that's number one. The second place is the communist world, because the communists say, this is great. We can point to the fact that Israel is backed by the United States, and we're backing the PLO, and that will get us the sympathy of all the Arab masses. So they won't ask the uncomfortable question, why are we the Soviets ruling 100 million Muslims in Central Asia and the States? They'll instead focus their attention on the fact that the Soviet Union is helping to attack Israel, or helping those who attack Israel. The third zone is the left and the West. The left is an important presence in Western Europe. I'm going to speak about this more next week, I hope. But for the first time, in significant political circles, and sure as heck cultural circles, in Paris, in London, places like that, in Germany, in Italy, you remember they start wearing the keffiyehs, and they identify, one way or another, with the Al-Fatah. And finally, in the third world, in Africa and Asia, in those places, you say, what's that got to do with the Arab-Israeli struggle? Oh no, Israel is a colonialist power. It's the same thing as South Africa and so forth. And they've stolen our land, and the Africans will buy it, and the Asians will buy it for a variety of reasons, But this is a reality that Israel has to face. So again, who won the Six-Day War? You see what I'm saying? Who won? Now, for the only place, fortunately, this didn't get traction, is in the United States of America, outside of a couple of crazy campuses. Okay, so you got your Noam Chomsky types, and you do, starting around then. But in the broad Hamon Am, in the 60s and 70s, this was still a country that was sympathetic towards Israel. That was the big exception. Now, for the Palestinians, therefore, the period of 1967 to 73 is a period of a political great leap forward in terms of establishing the reality of their presence in the world. This is terrible for Israel, because Israel has no response. It doesn't work like Golda Meir said, there are no Palestinian people. She sounds nuts when she says that. I know what she means technically, but it doesn't work. It makes Israel look terrible, you see? And so the Six-Day War was a big plus for Arafat and company, because I say in company because Arafat's group was one of 10 or 20, and there many were, believe it or not, more extreme than him. Really they're not, but you understand what I mean, but they're more active and more extreme within the world of Palestinian politics. They all have the same idea in mind, obviously. And so, as I said, Arafat and the Palestinians, let me leave it at that. The one good aspect of this whole problem is that during the period I'm talking about, which is between the Six-Day War and the 73 War, the PLO and Arafat and those guys do not enter the thinking of Nixon and Kissinger. To them, these different groups are crazies and terrorists. And that's how they thought. And that's a good thing. Because, not to the rest of the world. He said because in their mind, if there's a solution to the problem, it's not through the terrorists, as they would put it. Nixon wasn't the type of, he was very thoughtful in areas of foreign policy. This was one in which he didn't look into very closely, a good thing. And he said, there's Israel and the Arab countries, and that's all there is to it. Instead, he wanted, King Hussein, okay? So, as you see over there. So if you're going to deal with the West Bank, which they certainly did, that's a question of two different countries. And that's dealt with in a completely different way. It's through political negotiations. And Golda Meir feels the same way. And Golda Meir has many negotiations with King Hussein, secretly. During this period. The problem is that in the years 1967-73, Golda does not really want to give up any part of the West Bank to King Hussein on very simple terms. Eretz Yisrael Shlema, I mean, why not? Who doesn't like that map? you can totally understand it. Why should you give the Arabs a foothold anywhere and cause trouble for Israel if you don't have to? So this is what's going on then. Now, King Hussein, obviously, is going to insist on return of the whole West Bank, But it's clear from day one, although the Israelis didn't want to admit it to themselves, he also wants back to Harabayas for perfectly understandable reasons. He had it before, and to them, it's a Muslim holy spot. You understand? Here's the King Hussein just before the Six-Day War. This is a few weeks before the Six-Day War, visiting the Harabayas, which is the mosque. Maybe he'll let the Jews, I think this would have happened, let the Jews pray at the Wailing Wall. You understand? In other words, as a special zone, you could go there and daven. But that's it. Okay? The rest of it has to be returned to Jordan. And aside from the fact he really felt that way, if he would yield on that, he'd be dead. So it's a basic dynamic of the negotiating process that he can't give in on the Harabayas, let alone East Jerusalem in general. And a lot of the negotiations that were secretly taking showed Israel's trying to eat away at this and change it and this and that and the other. But he was pretty firm on that, and I can totally understand why. And aside from that, Golda Meir and the others are afraid that the PLO in those years looked very much like it was about to overthrow King Hussein, which they came close to doing in 69 and 70. They came close, and then what happens? In other words, if we give in and give the West Bank back to Jordan with a peace treaty and all the rest of it, what happens when Arafat kills Hussein and he takes over, and now you got an Arafat state within a few miles of Tel Aviv? This is basically the problem that Menachem Begin was able to call attention to. Yeah, in other words, who's riding the tiger, right? The Jordanians took in the PLO after the Six-Day War, figuring they could control them, and King Hussein, I talked about it last year, came this close to being, in 1970, to being overthrown by the PLO. Only his army launched a full-scale war, and they killed everybody in September and October of 70, and another round later, and wiped out, you hear what I said? Wiped out the PLO. Some of you may possibly remember the pictures in the news where the PLO guys ran to Israel. Do you recall this? They crossed the Jordan River, coming and surrendering to Israel because the Israelis won't kill them. You follow? So in the end, as it turned out, Lamaisa, King Hussein ended up controlling his own country. But it's an inherently unstable situation. Bibi Netanyahu, let's go to the next one. The Begin became famous by making the point that I just told you in the 69 election in 1970-71, which is, who's to stop Arafat from having cannon 10, 15 miles away from Tel Aviv, and he said, Kfar Saba, and he named all the places, all the rest of it. And he was right. Bibi can point to this problem today. What I mean to say is like this. If Abu Mazen, which is not going to happen, but if Abu Mazen said, okay, tomorrow I'm changing my mind, we're actually going to sign a Donald Trump peace pact. Let's just pretend. He's going to Donald Trump peace pact, and we're going to do everything and promise all the rest of it. And Israel pulls out of all that. And what happens a week later when the Hamas takes over? Or a month later, or a year later, Won't take that long. What happens when they take over? That's what happened in Gaza, isn't it? They pulled out for the PLO stuff. And it was all supposed to be signed and sealed and delivered. Everything was going to be great. And, they'll be on their side of the border, and we'll be our side of the border. This was the genius plan of Ariel Sharon. And then what happened? Oh my goodness, Hamas took over. I'm shocked. And then everything turned around, and now it's a cancer, right? So this is what I'm calling your attention to is something you probably know, which is this inherent structural problem with the Arab-Israeli conflict vis-a-vis the occupied territories, as they call it. It's an inherent structural project. This problem will never go away. It's existential. The dynamic's not going to change, at least as far as I can see. And so Israel's in this tough spot. And they were at that time also. So by the Yom Kippur War, my point is that nothing had changed in spite of many meetings between Hussein and the Israelis. As we've seen, Jordan did not join the attack on Israel in 1973. Under pressure, they sent a brigade to Syria. Wasn't the real thing where Jordan could have attacked all along the border of the Jordan Valley across into Israel. They didn't do that. They had very good reasons not to do it. When the Yom Kippur War was over, the consensus of the Arab governments and the Arab street was that Jordan would never be able to get Israel to withdraw from the West Bank. And this was an accurate assessment, as we know today, though King Hussein did not agree with that, nor did Nixon and Kissinger. They said, no, maybe we can get Israel to pull out. Don't give up on that option. As he shuttled tirelessly in the aftermath of the war, Kissinger planned to do a 3 in a row. That was the plan. First, to get a withdrawal from Sinai, which we talked about. Then you get a withdrawal from the Golan Heights, which we talked about. And then you get a withdrawal from the West Bank. Okay? All in exchange for a real, genuine peace treaty. That was the policy of the United States under Kissinger. Kissinger knew this was not going to be easy, and therefore he was committed to what they call a step-by-step process. That's all. Let's be realistic. As we've seen, he spent 7 months, from November 73 to May of 74, 7 months securing a very partial Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai and a partial withdrawal from the Golan. As we've seen, Israel did not really end up withdrawing from much territory at all. Let's take a look at the map here. No, yeah, eventually, okay, here we go. When all said and done, 95% of the Sinai, if not more, stays in Israel's hands. Agreed? They moved away from a zone near the canal. The Israelis used to be up to the canal, and then they had to pull out with a buffer zone and all that kind of junk. But take it all, including all of it, all the rest of it is still under Israel. Again, look at the Golan Heights with all those lines of the UN forces, all the rest of it. The part that they withdrew from is tiny, okay? It was less than 5%. Israel still controlled the bulk of the Golan Heights. Basically, they pulled out from Cantor, and that's what happened. So my point is like this. It was very hard work to get a little bit done. To get a little bit done. To start the process, the point was to start the process that would eventually lead to full withdrawal and peace. That was the goal. But it was a long-term goal. And it was very slow and very difficult. But at least it's logical. It's a political process with a clear end game. You know, another 5%, another 5%, another 10%, and then it'll go there. And you and I know it worked in the case of Egypt, okay? Which is why it led to this eventually, didn't it? It was a little this, a little this. Of course, it didn't exactly happen the way precisely that they envisioned it, but the basic yesod was a little peace for a little land, a little more peace for a little more land, and so on and so forth. And finally, it worked. Now, King Hussein, who after Black September, that civil war really did rule his country, wanted to be very much a part of this process that I just showed you, of the Kissinger process. Above all, he wanted an Israeli commitment to such an end goal, because Israel did commit to Kissinger, very hesitantly, that in the case of Egypt and Syria, even Syria, although I don't think they meant it, if they'll get a mamish, a full peace treaty and all that business, I mean, they'll really mean it, then they will pull out of the territory that they had occupied. I'll say it again, with Egypt, it did happen. Syria, if Syria would be a different country, other than Assad, maybe it would have happened, although it's much more complicated, because then you're going to be below the Golan Heights, they could shoot down on you. It would be hard. And Jordan, well, King Hussein's like this, I'm better, I'm the biggest tzaddik here. I'm better than Syria. He meant it. I'll give a real peace treaty. We really will. I mean it. I just need everything back. But if we get everything back, the Jews can go visit their holy places. He meant it. We will prevent terrorism raids and stuff like that into Israel. He meant it. Okay? So what's the problem? You see? So he wanted an Israeli commitment to such an end goal, but Israel refused. They only did it with Egypt and Syria because of the war, because of the military situation that I've explained at great length. Such a situation simply did not exist with regards to Jordan, correct? So as I said before, this was due to pressure. They didn't want to do it. And Jordan, Nebuch, had no pressure that they could exert. So Kissinger writes in his memoirs how frustrated he was, because Jordan was the good guy, and you're rewarding the bad guys for bad behavior. But that, my friends, is often how it goes in the international world, whether we like it or not. Okay, that's it. As I said, Nixon and Kissinger would like to help Jordan on many philosophical grounds, and many times in the Kissinger shuttles, many times, he was always, as his new wife, they're always visiting King Hussein. You know, whenever he went, he tried to give him a lot of cover, and he tried his best to include it within the loop. So whenever he went to Syria and Syria and Egypt, he always made sure to stop in Jordan and give him a lot of cover and report fully what's going on. In other words, he's trying to send signals. We, the Americans, want Jordan to be part of this process. Hint, hint, Israel. But it didn't happen. Golda Meir is not interested, and Rabin, when he takes over, is less interested. Certainly in the mid-1974. Now, in later years, Yitzhak Rabin would change his mind. Okay, that's enough for that. But I'm talking about at that time. The Israeli leadership in 74 and 75 and 76, from the Labor Party, from the left-wing party, are as traumatized as the rest of the country by the war and are maneuvering simply to keep their heads above the water. We don't remember what it was like to be in the Israeli leadership in the difficult years of the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War. Israel's leadership is focused like a laser on maintaining the American relationship. They could not afford to hurt that. That was their one lifeline, okay? And the American leadership was going through the Watergate. Agreed? So basically Israel was a situation, Rabin and Peres, just trying to roll with the punches, trying to survive Kissinger pressure, that's all, without alienating the United States of America, because, oh my God, they cannot afford that, right? They can't afford to alienate anyone. The bottom line is that King Hussein cannot deliver an Israeli withdrawal from any part of the West Bank. This played, obviously, into the hands of Arafat. The Palestinians have always held that they're not Jordanian and that the annexation of 1948 that I talked about was simply a hurrah shah. It was an emergency temporary measure. They didn't really want to be permanently under King Abdullah and King Hussein. They just had no choice in 48 because of the Israeli War of Independence and the success of the Israeli army. But they don't really want their own state. This has been their essential taina. Until 1967, Jordan could disagree with the PLO because Jordan ruled the West Bank. Between 67 and 73, as I just told you, it got very complicated. But if Jordan had recovered the West Bank, maybe it could have remained the legal rulers of the West Bank. But Jordan did not, and that played into the hands of the PLO. So I think you see where I'm going with this. The big victor, the big gainer of the 73 war was also the PLO. They gained the Palestinians. They gained from the 67 war, and they gained from the 73 war. It's just interesting. The PLO used the perception of Jordanian weakness to argue for Jordanian irrelevance. In other words, instead of Jordan being the one which is tasked by the Arab world to recover the West Bank, it should be the PLO who is tasked. And that meant that whatever was to be the future of the West Bank, now it's the bailiwick of the PLO, not the Jordanians. There's one group involved over here. This idea takes wings in the aftermath of the Kissinger shuttles of the summer of 1974. After all, you can't get a bigger punch in the nose to Israel than doing that, and it was. And so, unfortunately, in the fall of that year, at the Arab Summit Conference in Rabat, Morocco, in October of 74, 1 year after the Yom Kippur War, the Arab world, all their countries, got together and unanimously voted to recognize the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. That's not just a cliche, that's got a lot of power behind it. What they're saying is like this: you want to know what's going to happen in the West Bank? You deal with them. That's the one you got to deal with. No one else, not King Hussein or anybody else, is entitled to speak on their behalf. You got to talk to them. I'm talking about Israel has to talk to them. This is a tremendous blow, obviously, to King Hussein. But it also made the political scene, my friends, very interesting, because if it's the PLO and their charter calls for destruction of Israel, how can there be diplomacy with Israel? They want to negotiate for Israel to get stuff. But on the other hand, they're committed to the destruction of Israel. Now, communists don't find this a problem. You fight and negotiate at the same time. No, I'm serious. They've done that successfully. But Israel wasn't like that. And if there isn't diplomacy, then the only other way is the PLO is going to have to build a mighty army to fight Israel and destroy Israel. And how are they going to do that? It couldn't then and it can't today. If Jordan had been sidelined, then Israel doesn't have to negotiate with King Hussein because he's irrelevant. So in the short run, the Palestinians shot themselves in the foot from the point of view of participating in the Kissinger peace process, which is the only process out there that can possibly deliver Israeli concessions. So by adopting a strong policy of opposition to the very existence of Israel, Kissinger said, well, you're not Nagaya, right? Because I'm dealing with countries whose end game is to get an Israeli withdrawal in exchange for a complete and total peace, an honest, genuine peace. And you're not into that. So, which was true. Now, all this, by the way, is historical hindsight, of course. That's what makes this all fun. We know, looking back, that what the Palestinians did by their policy was they delayed an Oslo deal by 2 decades. That's what we're talking about. From 74 to around 94, right? They delayed it by 2 decades. But at the time, it certainly was a triumph for the PLO, and the whole world was impressed. You can't help it, right? With the exception of the USA. But every other country said, okay, if the PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and all the Arab countries say so, it stands to reason that that's who you should deal with, who you should negotiate with. And so for the next 2 decades, till 74 to 94, diplomats and leaders everywhere would say, why doesn't Israel negotiate with the PLO? I know about the charter, but that's not important. You work it out in negotiations. The Europeans said it, the Japanese said it, everybody said this. Go push it, okay? And Israel constantly said no, all right? We're not interested in negotiating with people because we know what their end game is. Right? Their end game is not a two-state solution, okay? The short-term Israeli reaction was a wall-to-wall rejection of negotiations over the West Bank. I'm talking about in the 70s. After Begin is elected in 77, things will change. And then the Israeli Labor Party will completely do 180, and then they'll actually be committed very strongly to exactly a Jordanian deal. That's what they'll do. But in the time I'm talking about, under the Rabin government in 74, 75, 76, it was not that way. Now, Arafat and the Palestinian groups, understandably, 74 now I'm talking, wanted to secure a state of some point as soon as possible. I mean, of course they do. You want to get state power, that's the name of the game. Which means that they wanted to participate in the political negotiations that were going on. Israel and the United States took the position that the PLO was not a political body actually elected by the Palestinians. It was a terrorist organization that advocating killing Israelis, and that makes you treif, because the United States is only dealing with people who are not committed to violence as a constant policy. And Imtim Salomar, even if it had been elected, since it was committed to terrorism, was not a party to negotiate. And even if it stopped terrorism, since its stated goal is the destruction of Israel, it can't be a party to a negotiation whose goal by definition is some kind of a two-state solution, meaning Israel here and Jordan there, or a Palestinian state there, but it can't be one that's like you say today, a Hamas state, which is only to use it as a springboard to attack Israel. Now, for its part, the PLO claimed they're not into killing Israelis as a mode of terrorism, because that's a dishonorable thing under international law, but rather they're into waging war against the Israeli state, which is an honorable thing under international law, at least under some circumstances, right? Going back to Grotius, right? Then they write the famous Yuri Belli Pashas, The Laws of War and Peace, in which they established the Western tradition that there are legal wars and illegal wars. And you're not supposed to fight against civilians, and all the rules, but I'll use terms that you'll understand. Geneva Convention, okay? Even though it wasn't at that time. There is a Western tradition in which war, under certain circumstances, is an honorable thing, okay? And under other circumstances, it's not. You have to follow the rules. So I'll give you an example. The way Hitler waged the war, they say is dishonorable. The way the Kaiser waged the war in the First World War was honorable, like that. So that's coming out of that tradition. Now, that's what the Palestinians argue. Mind you, it doesn't mean that they're interested in a genuine two-state solution. Obviously, they wanted a state, and from there they'll launch a worse attack against Israel. The language Arafat uses, and only a yeshiva bacher will understand, to me, Medayik and Deloshan over here, Arafat said like this: if Israel evacuates any area, no matter how small, we are fully prepared to set up a state in that territory. So somehow that sounds good to the American ear, but he didn't say anything. You follow what I'm saying? Yeah, sure you're set, and then what? You understand? But I want to tell you something. There are dummies out there that always were and always will be. And so in 1974, 5, 6, a lot of prominent Americans, for example, McGovern and Howard Baker and a whole bunch of other people, end up going through tours in the Middle East, and they always take them to see Arafat. And Arafat said, we're ready to set up a state any time. I'm prepared today, without any preconditions, to enter into negotiations with the state of Israel. Sounds very good. Again, if you're Medayik and Deloshan, you know what he means, right? I'm prepared to enter negotiations, and my end goal I'll have from here, exactly, negotiations of how to chop your head off. But, McGovern comes back, and the other comes and say, oh, he's a very reasonable guy, all the language here was moderate, what's the problem? Israel being too stubborn, and so on and so forth. Now, Israel's categorical refusal to recognize the PLO as a player obviously prevented the PLO from being one. Does that make sense? You got to have a negotiation with two parties. If I'm not talking to you, we don't have a negotiation with two parties. In response, the PLO undertook to force the hand of Israel by utilizing the widespread dislike of Israel outside of the United States. Every country now gets a diplomatic blitz, and receives Arafat on state visits. He gets received publicly in every country. Many countries set up embassies of some sort or another for the PLO. Pro-PLO sentiment sweeps Europe. Do you remember this? Every week he's going to tell you he gets accepted by Japan and by India and obviously by Pakistan and this country and Ecuador and Argentina and all over the world, you see? And so he's making a statement, I'm a legitimate country, so you Israel have to negotiate with me. That's the subtext. So my friends, as I said before, it's evident who was the big winner of the Yom Kippur War. Now, Israel is helpless against this, although it tries. Now remember, we're talking about the mid-70s. There was no Alaska pipeline, and there was no North Sea oil that came a little bit later. This is why Trump is pushing to get the oil, so that we won't have to worry about being squeezed by the Middle East under any circumstance. That is the reason. He doesn't care about the environment and all that business. He doesn't. He says, we want to get in a situation where you can't squeeze us. But in the 70s, they could squeeze. That was the reality. In the 70s, the West was under the pressure. So, the years 74 to 80, in addition, coincide with the high water mark of communist success internationally as the Reds win the Vietnam War. Or am I mistaken? Did we win it? Okay. The Reds take over Nicaragua. They successfully contend and take over Angola and Mozambique. And many countries beyond that. People forget the mid-70s and what it was. Castro was sending soldiers. They take over Nicaragua. Here is, right here you can see it. You know, these are huge areas. Namibia, Angola, Mozambique. I know they don't mean much to a lot of people, but look what a big chalik of Africa this is. It used to be Portuguese colonies. And the Portuguese were finally kicked out in the mid-70s. And the groups that took over were communist groups. There were other groups that had civil wars, but I don't know if you recall this. The Soviets ferried Fidel Castro's army to Africa, and they beat the non-communist forces. So in the today, you know, since Russia fell, so this looks like yesterday, but at that time, this was a big deal. So the United States was collapsing in the international arena in many ways. During this period, it looked like the tide of history is on the side of Russia. The world at that time looked very, I remember this, maybe you do. In the 70s, things looked pessimistic. It looked like they're going to beat us, we're not going to beat them. Even Kissinger was accused of thinking that way. It was terrible. Look at this. Remember the last helicopter off the embassy? And so many people that fell off. You see like that, right? It fell off. So it was what it was. The Russians, as we know, were so successful in the 70s that they overextended themselves and they would even try Afghanistan. And the United States was so angry at this, they would support the jihad, like I told you last week. Okay? One of the most important international reflections of this dynamic, one of the most important acts of political theater, which is nothing to be laughed at, took place 1 month after the Rabat conference, in which Arafat was given his title, when the United Nations General Assembly invited Yasser Arafat to address the United Nations, which is an act of supreme symbolism. The nations of the world are accepting the Palestinian narrative, that they are a people, despite the words of Golda Meir, and despite all the mass science type arguments that the Palestinians are not a people because they never had a state. I get it all. We know those. The world says like this, we're not going to any of that stuff. They declare themselves a people, they entitle a state, and you know, we're not interested in any of the other arguments the other way. The only difference among the members of the United Nations was how much of the Palestinian narrative was accepted. The Muslim states and many others bought the whole narrative. So Israel has no right to exist. You heard the speech this past week from Abu Mazen. It's not really the Jews, and the whole state of Israel is a bunch of baloney, and in the Holocaust, the Jews didn't want to run to Israel. You know what I'm talking about, right? So most countries of the world buy that whole picture. Others, like the Europeans and so forth, bought part of the narrative. We don't say wipe out Israel, but you should definitely give the Palestinians a state. The communist countries straddled the fence because the Soviet Union had declared in 1948 Israel be a legitimate country, and just like the Pope, Stalin does not make a mistake. They can't ever say that. You understand? Even though they'd like to. So he said Israel has the right to exist in the 47 borders. You get it? In the 47 borders. Because Stalin said it was the right thing to do, so, you know, it's part of doctrine. However, it's an easy way for the Reds to score points. And by the way, everybody knew if Israel crazily, whatever, pulled back to that, they wouldn't last a minute. Even in the USA, even in the United States of America, the career diplomats favor accommodation with the Palestinians, because that's what the State Department guys are. It is only because in the years 74, 75, and 76, the United States foreign policy is totally dominated by one man, by Henry Kissinger, that the career diplomats do not control the foreign policy, only Kissinger does, was it significant, therefore, that he does not buy the Palestinian narrative. He's committed to Hussein narrative. So the United States, whatever the individual diplomats, and I can tell you, they all, I remember when I was in school, I used to get the lectures from some of these guys, David Ness and the others, the Palestinians are really right and all the rest of it. The only guy that counted in those years was Kissinger, okay? And he didn't gyrus the Palestinians. But the USA was an exception, as reflected in the reception accorded to Arafat at the United Nations. Take a look at this. The whole world. He's wearing a gun. All right. Notice, you better accept the olive branch or I'll shoot you. If somebody talks like that, let me tell you one thing. Keep your eye not on the olive branch. You follow? Now, what was the actual speech itself? It's a long, fortunately, he was not a good talker. It's a long, rambling speech. But here's the parts that are most nogea to an audience of the United Nations, the third world. Still, the highest tension exists in our part of the world. The Zionist entity clings tenaciously to occupied territory. Zionism persists in its aggressions against us, our territory. New military preparations are feverishly being made, as Israel's planning another Yom Kippur war. These anticipate another fifth war of aggression to be launched against us. Such signs being the closest possible watching, grave likelihood would forebode nuclear destruction, cataclysmic situation, is a total liar. Okay? Now, it's an important point I'm saying. The use of lies and the applause to lies is what's really going to undermine the United Nations system. If it's really lies and somebody gets away, we applaud him, and you know he's thinking not true, that's a problem for your organization. It's what we call today the fake news, Trump news, and this business. If nothing is the truth. You follow? The world's in need of tremendous efforts, aspiration to peace, freedom, justice, equality, development, realism, struggle, victory, colonialism, imperialism, neocolonialism, racism, all its forms, including Zionism. So Zionism is a form of neocolonialism and racism. We'll get back to that a little bit later. Only by such efforts can natural form be given aspiration of all peoples, including aspirations to state oppose such efforts. It's this road that leads to fulfillment of the principles of the United Nations. If the status quo is simply made, the world will be exposed to prolonged conflict in addition to economic, human, and cultural calamity. So this is the heart, as far as I can tell, of the talk. So therefore, in order to save the world, you got to get rid of Israel, or the Zionist entity. Now, Israel was naturally traumatized. It realizes to its horror that if not for the USA, Israel might be expelled and sanctioned, which they cannot survive. So what I'm trying to tell you is like this: Israel was asleep at the switch. That's what Yitzhak Rabin was, and the cabinet at that time. They just, have very narrow understanding. But now they do. There's a kind of inchoate plan to destroy Israel that they perceive now through lethal international legal action to undermine Israel's legal legitimacy. The truth is that could work very well. If you can mamish get the United Nations and all that to say that Israel really is a bunch of thieves. I mean, literally. They have no right to be there, and the whole world's going to act that way. Israel doomed. They can't handle a sanction by the whole world. Nobody can. They can't handle a cherem by the whole world. Nobody can. Even if the U.S. doesn't go along, if everybody else goes along like that, Israel and the Haktitsars, you understand? And that's the Arabs winning without shooting a bullet, without launching any war. It's an insidiously clever possibility. Fortunately, at that time, the Americans threw their weight around to prevent that from happening, as we'll see. But the problem gets bigger, Buoyed up by success in November of 74, the Arafat countries worked to get Zionism classified as racism under international law. That's another angle. Okay? Here we get what we call in the universities the hegemonic discourse of leftism, which means everything's about classification. If I get you classified as a racist, then you have no legitimacy. This is the reason people vote for Trump, because they can't stand the political correctness. If I say something over here, I immediately get classified as a this, or you get classified as that. They won't admit they voted for him, you see? So the polls don't reflect it. But they couldn't stand the trend in which you have this kind of dominant discourse in which you have to say this. If you don't say this, then you're automatically classified as that. But it works. It can anyway, okay? And somebody could get fired for saying the wrong thing. It happens. And somebody could get, penalized for advocating the wrong thing. And this is a language that dictators and hegemonists, especially leftists, have used for much of the 20th century, particularly the last third, in these third world contexts. And now the gun was pointed towards Israel, or more specifically towards Zionism. If you can get Zionism classified under international law as racism, it's delegitimized. Because there's always a million people out there that say like this, well, look up what is in the book. If the book it says it's racist, then it's illegitimate. You understand? Most people don't think for themselves. Never have, never will. Most people go by what they see in books and what they see in authoritative documents. So if the FBI classifies this person as a dangerous person, me, myself, and I say, I guess he must be a dangerous person. The FBI said it. Is it possible the FBI is wrong? You don't usually think that way, correct? If they said back in the McCarthy area, this guy's a communist, I guess he must be a communist. They say he's a communist, he must be. That's how most people are. So if you say Zionism and Israel is therefore classified as a legally racist entity, well, okay, that's the end of that. Then obviously the United States can't support them, or Europe can't support them. The United States does, and it's abetting racism, and so on and so forth, and such. Now, one of the things that was criminalized by the United Nations in its founding, in the context of a just finished war against Hitler, who had been perceived correctly as the apostle of racism, which of course he was. This is racism in the narrow sense of saying that what determines all behavior is your race, assuming that there is such a thing, okay? That's the sole and significant determinant of everything about you. So to Hitler, if you're Jewish, I don't care if you found the cure for cancer. The fact you're Jewish makes you, by racial classification, chai misa. So this is a certain way of talking. So in reaction to that, the United Nations, which was the technical term for the alliance between England, the United States, and Russia in World War II, they came at the end of the war with a new organization called the United Nations Organization, which was in principle opposed or delegitimated racism. I might point out to you, in the First World War, it wasn't like that when it made the League of Nations. The Big Four rejected the proposal by Japan, which was a world power and it fought on the side of the Allies, that they should come out as part of the League of Nations in principle to delegitimate racism. But they said, let me put it this way, Woodrow Wilson was a racist. You get it? The United States at that time had 1 million laws on the books, true or not, what they called the Jim Crow, let alone all the other countries in the British Empire, all the rest of it. So they said, no, we're not going to condemn racism. We may, like I'm doing that massage, make it better, but they're not going to in principle delegitimate their own policies, you see? So it's interesting. Now, if they were hesitant after the First World War, they were not hesitant after the Second World War. Who wrote the Universal Declaration of Rights stuff for the United Nations? You read Mrs. Roosevelt. That's exactly. She was the ambassador. Well, you can't get more American than that. And what does it say over there? Everyone's entitled to all the rights, except for the Declaration, without distinction in terms of race, color, sex, religion, political, other opinion. Race, no distinction made in the base of all that. And everybody signed that. No, that simply was the totally understandable political correctness of 1945. Who is opposed to that? Right? I'm against racism. Who's opposed to that? You understand? Now, subsequently, over the decades, the United Nations, now that they had all these African nation countries join, criminalized colonialism, which is interesting, and racism and other isms. But these are broad terms. So if I can get you classified as a colonialist, or if I can get you classified as a racist, under United Nations international law, you're illegitimate with all the consequences that go along with it. I want to point out Israel has a law of return, which says if you're Jewish, you get instant citizenship. If you're not Jewish, you don't. So do about 100 other countries. Okay? You can look it up online. In Bulgaria and in Belgium and in the Czechs, what else you got? And Estonia, Finland, Germany, Greece, anything else? It doesn't matter. I mean, you need to do the whole list. That's fine. Japan has a law like that. I think I told you years ago. There's a great story about this guy. I read a book long ago. Who was a Russian Jew. Did I tell you this? And he wanted to escape to Israel, and he was a swimmer. And he was a very good swimmer. You know, almost Olympic. And naturally, this is the 1970s. If you're a good Olympic swimmer, you want to swim out of Russia, you know. And he tried to do it on the Black Sea, but there was minefields and stuff like that. And he was desperate, so he decided, a Jewish guy from Moscow, so he decided to go to the Vladivostok on the Pacific coast of Russia. And he'll get a job on a fishing boat, and he'll jump off and swim in Japan, because he was at Madrega. But of course, he had a problem with the sharks. So no. So listen to this. He says, so he was an intelligent guy. He went to the library and read every book there was on sharks. He became a bucky in sharks, and he knew if the shark goes like this, you go like that, and you bang it on the nose, and whatever. This is what people do. They're so desperate to get out of Russia. And Vladivostok is really close to Japan, if you know the map. It's very close to Japan. So he went to Vladivostok. He signed up on a fishing boat, and when it was 10, 20 miles, in the middle of the night, jumped off the ship and swam, son of a gun, he swam to Japan. He comes exhausted on the beach, and he goes to the first guy he sees, a Japanese policeman. I'm running away from Russia. Oh my God. They take him to the police station. And they say, you're a runaway. He said, I'm looking for asylum. Get me out of here. He said, no, you're what do you call it? Illegal from Russia. Got to send you back. Don't send me back. He said, got to send you back. I'm Jewish. Call Israel. I'm a citizen of Israel. I said, there's no such thing. They said, just do it. See what happens. So they called Israel embassy. The Israel sent a guy right there, and he gave him a passport. They said, this guy is automatically a citizen of Israel. And the Japanese guy said, that's bogus. He said, look at Japan's laws. You got the same law. And they did. That's my point. Japan has the same law. Any Japanese guy wants to come, he's instantly a citizen. And the guy called the justice thing. He said, okay. Then he's like this. Get him out of here now. You know, we didn't see him. He's got to get out of here now, because when the Russians come and find out, we can't stop this. He said, no problem. And he took him right there from the police thing into a car. He said, drive to the airport. And he called from the airport. He said, get me the first El Al plane or whatever. Get the first plane out of Japan. It so happened it was to Manila. He said, get this guy in Manila. Meanwhile, they send a telegram or something. They got an El Al plane, get him from Manila to Israel. And that's how he got out. My point is, it was a book. Yeah, I read a book. He says, in the 70s, I read this, or the 80s, the point is like this. Is Germany a racist country because they have a law of return? Is Japan a racist country because they have a law of return? No, Israel's a racist country because they have a law of return. You see where I'm going? Israel's a racist country because they have a law of return. Okay. So what's happening over here? Excuse me. So, the General Assembly, bureaucratic machinery, regardless of everything I just said, starts wending its way, you know, from the third committee to the second committee, the second committee to this committee, to the rights committee to that committee, the whole UN junk, wending its way for a resolution to be presented and passed at the 1975 General Assembly of the United Nations, all nations of the world, that Zionism is equal to racism. Okay? Here's the PLO representative over there, Terzi, who's a Christian, by the way, so therefore they say, see, you know, we're not prejudiced. And it's in there. The U.S. diplomats were just jaded. That's who they are. Guys like Scali and the others say, well, listen, the Arabs are going to do it. Obviously, we're not going to vote for it. This too shall pass. It's just a new reality we'll have to live with. A lot of things the United Nations do that we don't get along with. We don't want to alienate anybody more than it is. It's bad enough as it goes. So like I say, they were like over the hill. Okay? Excuse me. Kissinger had his hands full so much in the 70s that he usually does not pay attention. He usually does not pay attention to what's going at the UN. He's dealing with Russia. He's dealing with China. He's doing the Middle East, like the UN committee, the pass the resolution. You know, he was that type of guy. Okay? But under Nixon, many anti-American votes are cast in the General Assembly. Many. Do you remember this argument? It's not an east-west problem in the world today. It's a north-south. And the problem is that the North has all the resources, so they should give all the money to the South. So America should give all the money to Africa, Asia, and all the rest of it, South America. And as Atchison said, give it out in 20s. You know what I mean? That's the grand political philosophy of anti-colonialism. Okay? And the Russians are behind it all, they're a bunch of mamzerim. And then we get all these dictator types. Okay? He was Shevchenko. He was the Russian #2 guy at the UN. He defected later on, and he told all the thing in a book. You get it? He's the one, if you remember, the CIA defected by getting him girlfriends and booze and things like this. And when it came out in the Time magazine, a bunch of KGB guys said, "We want to defect too." You understand? They like his terms. But anyway, it was all cynical. That's my point. It was all cynical. They were just out to stick it to America. After all, they're dictator countries themselves. They're criticizing the U.S. for being unfair and racist and all the rest of it. And these are people killing people, their own people, every day. Kissinger and Ford, because Ford is now the president, do not like the increasing tempo of United Nations condemnatory resolutions. Just as the communists, at the same time, the communists themselves are violating international law and taking over countries, like I was telling you. What are you going to do? The U.S. diplomats, the striped pants boys, just say, roll with the punches. You understand? That's who they were. The concept of penalizing an African country or an Asian country for voting against America does not exist in the mind of the State Department employees of types. And then an article appears in a dramatic form. In the summer in Commentary magazine, The United States in Opposition by Daniel P. Moynihan, who we'll talk about in a second. And this had a big shock, all right? A big shock. Because for the first time, somebody called a spade. And he said, fight back. It's a long historical background. Oh my God, it's a long historical background to what the United Nations is and all these other sorts of things in the professorial style. But when you get to the meat, he said, fight back, call a spade. Don't fall for the third world communist garbage. Fight them. Argue with them. Tell them to their faces who they really are. They can't stand it. Expose them with pitiless publicity. Above all, make the intellectual case for the United States of America. Okay? So he wasn't a diplomat. It was intellectual. So he talked in a different language. Now, Moynihan was a very interesting guy. He started out as a juvenile delinquent in the Hell's Kitchen in the bad neighborhood of Manhattan. And it's an old classic story. You know, there used to be a thing in America called public school. And it actually used to work. And he went to public school in Manhattan in the 1940s. It really was a place. And you could pull yourself up from a poor background, and he came from a dysfunctional family. I'll say it again, he had a father who ran away. He had a dysfunctional family, and he pulled himself up, and by the time he was over, he was a Harvard professor. He did by his own efforts. It's the old, it sounds, look at this, is terrible? It's 2018, I sound like I'm talking like a fairy tale. It's possible through education to improve yourself and elevate yourself to another sphere, okay? And he ends up writing one of the most important books in sociology, where he talks about Beyond the Melting Pot, where he wrote with Nathan Glazer and Daniel P. Moynihan from Harvard about the Negroes, the Puerto Ricans, the Jews and Irish. So he studies all the ethnic groups at that time in New York City. Moynihan wrote about the Irish, obviously, and some other groups, and the Jewish guy wrote about the Jewish thing, the old story, the Jew and the elephants, So it was a bestseller. It was for many years, it was a required reading. And he's a liberal. He's a liberal Democrat. He was a John F. Kennedy liberal. And he was appointed by Kennedy as Assistant Secretary of Labor. That's what he was, under Kennedy and Johnson. And as Secretary of Labor, he's interested in employment and unemployment situations. And he sees is a gigantic skewed unemployment by the African Americans, by the black community. And he studies it as a Harvard professor. You have an Assistant Secretary of Labor who's a trained sociologist. Okay, let's get this straight. He's a trained sociologist. And so he authors the famous book that got him in big trouble called The Negro Family, in which he's saying the question, how can we have a group that's a gigantic unemployment out of whack with everybody else, and what's the root causes of it? And he said something which was 100% true, and everybody acknowledges that now, but you couldn't say it at that time. He said there are two different issues. There's Martin Luther King A and Martin Luther King B. Martin Luther King A is a question of legal racism. Is it conscionable that there should be two bathrooms, two water fountains? You can't vote because you're black. That someone who's a middle class, I'm using his term, a middle class family can't move into a neighborhood because of the color of their skin. that a middle-class, educated, law-abiding family can't get a job somewhere because of the color of their skin. That's called Martin Luther King A. In other words, that's unconscionable. At least America felt that way by the 1960s. And that's why they passed all the laws. There's a separate question, he said, Martin Luther King B, which nobody's talking about, which has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Here we're talking about a sociology issue in which millions of blacks have moved from the South, especially in World War I and particularly in World War II and afterwards, in huge numbers to cities that weren't ready for it. It's created a crisis of the Negro family. Okay? And the U.S. society doesn't know how to deal with it, and the welfare payments make it worse because they encourage the people not to get married, because you get more money, and then you create, without meaning it, you create a society where there's no father. Look what he said. There's one unmistakable lesson in American history, a community that allows a large number of young men to grow up in broken families dominated by women, meaning no father, never acquiring any stable relationship to male authority, never acquiring any set of rational expectation about the future. That community asks for and gets chaos. This was written in 1964. As I say, this was written in 1964. So you weren't allowed to say it, okay? And the result is he got fired from the Johnson administration. He went on. He went back to Harvard, and I'm just telling you, this is an unusual person because you think, yeah, you actually think, okay? And he went on to write a very famous and controversial critique of Johnson's Great Society programs, which he entitled Maximum Feasible Misunderstanding. Okay? Again, the idea being focused on New York City, which led to the anti-Semitic teacher strikes and things like that, if you remember from yesteryear. The point is like this. This is a different problem altogether. This has nothing to do with questions about separate bathrooms. Okay? That's a constitutional legal issue in which there was complete consensus. Here we're talking about something different. What's a rational way to try to create a family structure? And anybody who's taught in public schools knows what I'm talking about. This is the number one problem. And still today, no one's come up with a solid solution. And so experience, therefore, turns him into a liberal critic. I was a liberal of the Great Society. And he's one of the number of people, I'm going to talk about this more later in this series when I have time, I hope, who becomes what they call the commentary magazine crowd, or as we call the neoconservatives, the neocons, which had a foreign policy spin and a domestic policy spin. And these are people who were liberals and came out of liberal tradition, but they have thoughtful criticisms of specific, very strong, articulated, thoughtful criticisms of very specific aspects of United States foreign policy and of United States domestic policy. He became a big writer. So in other words, in the late 60s, you want to get the commentary magazine every month because there's some from Moynihan or James Q. Wilson or Potteretz or these guys. And, you know, you can agree with them, you can disagree with them, but the guy's saying something, or the lady's, she's actually saying something. It turned commentary into the number one magazine of thought and debate. Let's put it that way. And that got him a job under Nixon, actually, but that didn't last too long. Now, Moynihan's, in foreign policy, strongly anti-Russia. Look, the guy's a good Catholic. I'll show you a picture in a minute. They ask him when Meet the Press, is the Pope wrong or the Cardinal wrong? Is the Cardinal never wrong? You know, I learned that in school. Cardinal's not wrong.
Being very diplomatic here, Senator, is the Cardinal off-base?
Cardinals are never off base. They are frequently on.
Okay, you know, he's a frum boy from day school. You know, that's what it is. He went to parochial. So the point's like this. The point is, a guy like that's going to be very anti-communist. And this is the characteristic of the neoconservative, the neocons. So you could be a liberal. The best way for me to describe what I'm talking about is in that period, is the Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, Humphrey, Scoop Jackson Democrats, right? Which I don't think exists necessarily anymore. But that, and I think all of us were that, okay? You know, that was what they understood. That's what that was, which is liberal, okay? They are completely committed to civil rights. They're completely committed to the labor unions, okay? They're completely committed to the fair Social Security and things like that, but not pro-Russia and that sort of thing, and not counterproductive social policies, which you're not allowed to criticize, you see? But I got to worry about the crime. You know, that's the neocons. So as I say before, He got a job with the Nixon administration. Eventually, that led him to be appointed by Nixon as ambassador to India in the 70s. And when he's ambassador to India, there you see up front the third world baloney, because no country is so full of baloney like India. Indira Gandhi was getting all the money from America, stabbing America in the back and allying with Russia, and telling the people in India, Russia's giving us the money, things like that. You see, and then she declares a dictatorship for a while. It's a long business. He's up front, and he flies to China to visit there. He gets firsthand exposure, so he comes back hardened neocon. Okay? Now, let's put it this way. When he writes this article coming back from India, so he's up to here, he's actually giving voice to the people. The United States should realize when it comes to the United Nations, we're the opposition party. And just like the Republicans don't take it off the Democrats to shoot back, and just like the Democrats don't take it meekly off the Republicans to shoot back, we got to shoot back. And Kissinger actually reads the article and is shocked that he says, I should have written this, which by Kissinger is the biggest. So basically, they hire him as United Nations ambassador right there on the spot in base of the article. Okay? So as the Gemara says, you came up with the idea, so you do it. You United States opposition, you go to the UN, and he does. Nobody can do better than the guy who wrote this article. And so Moynihan will be there for only 7 months. It's interesting. From June 75 to early January, I think, 76, during which time he will enter the pages of Jewish history. With interesting personal consequences. And he begins his first speech at the UN by warning them, if you will tell lies about us, we'll get back at you by telling the truth against you. You understand? So watch out what you say, because it's a new day. Okay, it's a new day. Now, my point is that either you believe in coincidences or you don't. But it's amazing that this guy should happen to be the United Nations ambassador when the United Nations Zionist racism hits the floor of the General Assembly. Because it easily could have been one of these regular diplomats who are just mindless and go in an endless row. I could give you the pictures of Charles Yost and this one and that one. They're nothings. You understand? Instead, you had the exception to the rule. So I think, let's go to the next one. I think you had an unusual situation in your hands. Now, here we go. In early July of 75, it becomes clear that it's going to be a full court press by the Mamzerim to expel Israel from the United Nations. They're going to do it. In a speech delivered on July 14th, Kissinger in Milwaukee warns, if this happens, the United Nations, USA will quit the United Nations. On July 17th, even Europe gets together and says, Western Europe I'm talking about, if it's opposed to the expulsion of Israel. Excuse me. On July 18th, the next day, the United States Senate passes a resolution that if they kick Israel out, the United States is going out. Okay? Doesn't matter. 7 days later, on July 25th, the Organization of African Unity passed a resolution, we're going to expel Israel. Okay? Sadat, of all people, says don't expel Israel, because they got to be in the UN to listen to the UN resolutions when we talk about the withdrawals. You get it? So, oh my goodness. And who is it that's the Organization of African Unity? These are dictators or cannibals. I'm serious. If you know the record, they ate people. They shechted their relatives. It's unbelievable what goes on there. If you care to, if you have the stomach, go look up the records of these people. Just say African heads of state in 1975 and see what you come across. Okay? And they're saying Israel is is an illegal state. Finally, on November 9th, the process works its way through and comes the big vote. All the nations, the United Nations, are going to vote. Is Zionism equal to racism? There's a lot of speeches back and forth. Obviously, the only one who speaks in favor of Israel beforehand is the Israeli ambassador, Chaim Herzog. So that's interesting. He should have had Abba Eban or Golda Meir, if you want my opinion. But anyway, Chaim Herzog's okay, and he was, if you know, he was a trained lawyer from Cambridge University. I mean, he had a law degree, and he'd been an officer in the British Army and general in the Israeli Army, and he was a popular spokesman in Israel during the wars. He was okay, and he gave a passionate speech. But I don't think, notice it's a Jewish speech, and God bless him, and I'll show it to you in a minute. can't listen to the whole thing, but a piece of it. And he says it's from a Jewish heart, and he knew Yiddishkeit. His father was Rav Herzog, after all. Okay, his brother should have been the one there, but the brother was dead. He says because the brother was a big Talmud Chacham. He really understood Judaism, but still he said like this. This is interesting. We're having this vote on Kristallnacht. Well, I'm going to tell you something. It means something to you. It doesn't mean anything to these people in the United Nations. It means nothing to them. That's the point. And I'm tearing up the bed here. Take a look at this. That's okay. You know what I mean? It's okay. But he didn't home run, as far as I'm concerned. And then they took the vote, right? Do we have that in here? Yeah, okay, well, they didn't record it. But you can see yourself, you just get on in there. 72 against Israel, the Zionism racism. I would like to point out, for example, Mexico. How you like that? Okay? I would like to point out, for example, Brazil. Okay? Imagine that. Now, Mexico did, I remember very clearly, President of Mexico was Echeverria. He was one of these Mexican politicians, which tells you everything. And he wanted to get elected the next UN Secretary General. So he didn't mind making a moral stain. You see what I'm saying? Just for a temporary political advantage. That is to say like this. There's nothing that's not for sale. That's my point. There's nothing that's not for sale. You want to declare Zionism racism? It's no big deal to him. You had, this is pro-Israel, and you have basically the European countries, the British Commonwealth, the U.S., and a couple of, and a couple of South American countries. Most of the South Americans kind of abstain, okay? Which is not as bad as it is, but it's a cowardice, you see? So as I say before, this is more or less a scroll of dishonor. Keep that in mind. Right after the speech, Moynihan gave a speech, okay? He said, you'll see in a minute. And I got this off the internet, and it's too long. I'm going to subject you to torture for a reason. I'll give about 10 minutes of it. Can't do the whole thing. And he has a quirky way of talking, but he gave it to him on the chin, as far as I'm concerned. And he gave one of the great, in my opinion, one of the great speeches of the late 20th century. Right off an art.
There appears to have developed in the United Nations the practice for a number of countries to combine for the purpose of doing something outrageous. And thereafter, the outrageous thing having been done, to profess themselves outraged by those who have the temerity to point it out, and subsequently declare themselves innocent of any wrongdoing in consequence of it having been brought.
That's a professor talking.
In reaction to the insufferable acts of those who pointed the wrongdoing out in the first place. Out of deference to these curious sensibilities, the United States chose not to speak in advance of this vote. We speak in its aftermath and in tones of the utmost concern. The United States rises to declare before the General Assembly of the United Nations and before the world that it does not acknowledge, it will not abide by, it will never acquiesce in this infamous act. Not 3 weeks ago, the United States representative in the Social, Humanitarian, and Cultural Committee, and with what irony those terms ring on our ears today, pleaded in measured, fully considered terms for the United Nations not to do this thing. It was, he said, obscene. It is something more today for the furtiveness with which this obscenity first appeared among us has been replaced by a shameless openness. There will be time enough to contemplate the harm this act will have done the United Nations. Historians will do that for us, and it is sufficient for the moment only to note one foreboding fact. A great evil has been loosed upon the world. The abomination of anti-Semitism, as this year's Nobel Peace Laureate Andrei Sakharov observed in Moscow just a few days ago, the abomination of anti-Semitism has been given the appearance of international sanction. The General Assembly today grants symbolic amnesty and more to the murderers of the 6 million European Jews. Evil enough in itself, but more ominous by far is the realization that now presses upon us
denouncing this infamous undertaking. Next, one after another, the great private institutions of American life pronounced anathema on this evil thing, and most particularly the Christian churches have done so. Reminded that the United Nations was born in the struggle against just such abominations as we are committing today, the wartime alliance of the United Nations dates to 1942, the United Nations Association of the United States, for the first time in its history, appealed directly to each of the 141 other delegations in New York not to do this unspeakable thing. The proposition to be sanctioned by a resolution of the General Assembly is that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination. Now, this is a lie, but it is a lie which the United Nations has now declared to be a truth, and so the actual truth must be restated.
Okay, that's it. If you want to, and I recommend you do, you listen to the whole thing, it's about 25 minutes. It's quite remarkable. It calls it what it is. Okay? It's an abomination, it's obscene, and he gave a very powerful speech. As I said before, it's not so well known, and he has a little quirky way, as a professor, I understand that, but nevertheless, every once in a while, he has one of those sentences in which he tells the plain truth. Okay? And he knocked it out of the park. And it was so, nobody ever did this before. You're a bunch of liars, you're a bunch of anti-Semitic, you're a bunch of phonies, you're obscene, you're friends of Hitler, you have no legitimacy whatsoever, you just cut your own throats in the world of thought. That's what he said. Now Kissinger and Ford were a little taken back. They said, oh, this was, this speech was too aggressive, it's not very diplomatic. But all of a sudden they found out like this. Tens of thousands of telegrams, remember those? Tens of thousands are flooding the White House and the statement everybody else, pro. In other words, there was a wave of, he touched a nerve. There's a wave all across the country from all the different sectors saying he's absolutely right and long live this. So all of a sudden Kissinger and Ford says, oh no, we're 100% behind him. We wrote the speech, you know what I mean? And all this kind of stuff. That's what it was. I'll tell you a nice Baltimore fact, and that is that this was the General Assembly of the United Nations. And that means there's the ambassador, and then there's what's called the delegation, which is an honorific sort of thing. And president every year appoints some prominent people to be a member of the United Nations delegation. And one of them was Clarence Mitchell, like from the courthouse. Clarence Mitchell Jr., the civil rights guy. I'm talking about the father now, in the courthouse. So you see, if you actually go online and you look at it, when they say, how do you vote? He says, America votes no. No, it's Clarence Mitchell said it, because he said, I want the honor, right? To say America's position. For this, he was castigated by the black community. You understand? But he didn't care. So it's just interesting. The powerful criticism, notice this speech went around the world. It gets a lot of international traction, and it discredited the resolution in the eyes of intelligent people everywhere. Moynihan's speech stigmatizes the vote as something to be ashamed of, a low point in the UN, and that totally frustrated the PLO plan. Instead of this being a statement of world righteous indignation, it was exposed, because he dared to, for what it was, which is something disgusting. The Arabs were so angry, the PLO, they tried to assassinate him. Okay? This guy was behind it. I myself didn't know it. They came out with a book a couple years ago, Professor Gil Troy, called Moynihan's Moment. And it's all in there. They didn't assassinate him, by the way. Now, let me put it this way. What's the final result of all this? As he said, historians. Within 16 years, the world turned upside down. Okay? What do I mean by that? Communism was overthrown, and the new free nations that popped up in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, are ashamed because they read his speech. And you have new leaders like the new president of Czechoslovakia, the famous Václav Havel, whose very first speech to the people when he took over, immediately after communism fell, was what? I assume you didn't propose me for this office that I would lie to you also. The truth, as it says somewhere, shall set you free. Okay? And they really feel it. And notice what I'm trying to say is like this. Moynihan raised this vote to a symbol level. A symbol of what? Of what the Russians and the communists forced all of us, the Czechs, the Hungarians, the Poles, and all the other groups, we knew was a lie, and it is symbolic of the kind of lies that we had to say every day for 45 years under the communists. We had to say that red is yellow and black is white, and free is slave and slave is free. And by the way, he's an eloquent, speaks about this, and Solzhenitsyn and others. The worst thing they did to us was make us lie, 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 lie. And so there was no dignity left to the human being. Things that we take for granted in the United States. And so by 1991, after this happens, they look at this, they said this was a big mistake. It so happened that one person that was very impressed by the speech was George Bush Sr. He had been the UN ambassador a few years before Moynihan. They were friends. And right after the Saddam Hussein, the first war, the Schwarzkopf War under George Bush, if you remember, the United States was very powerful. They stood at a peak for a moment. Because Russia fell down, the new states in Eastern Europe all popped up, America busted Iraq, the Arabs were all dependent on the United States, so for 5 minutes, the country was very powerful, and George Bush, it's funny, but he did. George H.W. Bush, he said like this, I want the United Nations to repeal and say it was a lie. Okay? In 1991. And all the countries of Europe that voted before, they 100% behind that. This is an exact example of a lie. And so, therefore, in 1991, if you can look over here, this is from the New York Times, the UN repeals the 75 resolution, creating Zionism and racism. The United Nations voted overwhelmingly today to revoke the bitterly contested statement that Zionism forced racial discrimination. The official count found 111 nations in favor of repealing. Okay? Obviously, the 25 nations, meaning the Muslims and the North Korea and junk like that, voting against. 13 abstained, okay, and 17 others were absent. Egypt wasn't there that day, okay? Well, let's put it this way. If you're Kuwait, you better not have voted against Israel. Yeah, Kuwait also, because Bush just had a war to save you. You get what I'm saying? For the United States, the heavy vote in favor of repeal was a demonstration of a diplomatic power. After President Bush called for repeal in September in a speech to the General Assembly, U.S. embassies around the world were instructed to put total pressure to secure the repeal. Okay? So now they actually put the Moynihan into account. They went to Africa, to Asia, all the rest of it. He says, you want our help? You're going to vote with this. The 111 votes were 11 more than the U.S. mission had predicted last week, reflected the shifting political currents of recent years and so on and so forth. Okay? So it's rare. This is the only case where a resolution was revoked. Okay? It's the only case. And I'll say it again. In the former communist countries of Europe, they were jumping to do it. Okay? Because we didn't believe in the first place. This is one of the many, many things that Russia made us do during the years that they were messing us over and totally dominating it. Okay? Moynihan resigned in January, February of '76. 4 months later, he writes a bestseller, about the United Nations called Dangerous Place, which it is. Okay? Dangerous Place. In this case, you have a happy ending. The speech got him elected. He ran for Senate that year. One of the reasons he got, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that elected 100% of the Jewish vote in New York. I remember this. As a matter of fact, like I say, certain things stay in my mind. The Jewish press that week, when he resigned the UN, they said like this: he has to run, and every Jew is obligated to vote for him, something like that, because he ran against Bel Abzug, and therefore he was there for 20. Therefore he was there for 20 or how many years in the United States Senate. So it goes to show you that if you go in opposition and you tell the truth, sometimes the truth wins out. Now there's more to talk about, but the hour is late, so I'll close it up.